A racist police officer called Barry punched Sandra, a black pregnant woman. Officer Barry starts to cry when he learns who Sandra's dad is. His whole life seems to flash before his eyes. How will this encounter change both of their lives forever? Before we start the story, let us know where in the world you are watching from today. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you like it. Sandy stood next to her car with her hands shaking. Her heart was beating quickly. The late afternoon sun was shining hard on the empty, quiet road she had been driving on the moment before. After Officer Barry's squad car pulled up behind her, nothing moved. It felt like the world had stopped. The bright blue lights in her rearview mirror made her feel scared. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. She wasn't sick or anything. The little bump that had grown on her stomach over the past few months was smoothed out with her hand. At that point, she wasn't just thinking about herself. She was also thinking about her future child. Sandra took a short breath and turned around to face the police officer. Her mind was on all the things she knew to do to stay calm around police. Be nice, help them out, and don't move too quickly. But something wasn't right about Officer Barry. When he walked up, his teeth were clenched and his eyes were cold. He kept his hand on the rear view mirror on his hip. It was clear that he was mean as soon as he got out of his car. She knew something bad was going to happen because she could feel the stress in the air. "License and registration," he barked, and his voice was cold and stiff. Sandy stumbled as she quickly took the papers out of her bag because she was nervous. She was careful and moved slowly because she knew things could get worse quickly. She handed him the papers with shaky hands. She stuttered, I wasn't speeding," as she tried to figure out why she had been pulled over. Her heart was beating slowly as she thought about the baby and the peaceful life that was growing inside her. There had to be a problem. Barry quickly looked at her registration and then locked on her. He stared so hard that Sandra's skin crawled. "Get out of the car," he said, in a rough, stern tone. She stopped moving, and her heart beat faster. Step out of the car? Why? She was good. She didn't need to get out of the car. She wasn't a threat. A soft voice said, "I'm pregnant." She put her hand on her stomach again, as if to tell him to treat her like a person. But he didn't seem to care. Barry stepped closer and yelled, "Get out of the car." He put his hand on the baton that was hanging around his waist and put it on his belt. He did not feel sorry for or understand what she was going through. There was nothing but cold, pure power. Sandy's heart and mind were beating faster. What was going on? What was making him so mad? She tried hard not to worry as she took a deep breath. From the very beginning of the meeting, things did not go well, and she was aware that one more quick move could make things even worse. She took a deep breath and told herself to keep her cool. "Please," Sandra begged. "I don't understand. Why are you asking me to step out of the car? I haven't done anything wrong." Barry's face got tough, and he curled his lip in disgust. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he stated. "Step out of the car, or I'll make you get out." Sandra got a chill when she heard what he said. She was scared when she realized this wasn't a regular stop. It was a private tone. The way he looked at her wasn't about the law. It had to do with power. Before he even asked for her license, this cop already knew what he was going to do with her. There was only one of her, and she was black. The road was quiet. He didn't want to know why. He only told her who was in charge. He wasn't interested in her at all. She felt like a wave of weight hit her when she realized she was weak. She carried a life inside her, but he didn't seem to mind. He wanted to kill her, not someone else. That scared her more than anything else. Sandra didn't want to open the door, but she did it anyway. As she got out of the car, her hands were shaking. Even though her legs were weak, she stood as tall as she could. All the time, she kept her hand on her stomach. "Sandra, don't stress out. Don't let him hurt you." For some reason, Barry got taller than her as soon as she got out of the car. He moved back too, closing the gap between them. Sandra did the same. He kept looking at her with cold eyes and lips curled into a sneer. Barry growled, keeping his hand dangerously close to his gun. "What are you hiding?" Sandy could feel her heart beating quickly. Why did he say that? That was all she had to hide. She said, "I'm not hiding anything," and her voice shook. I'm just trying to go home." Barry did not pay attention, though. He made up his mind already. He was mad at her and would punish her. His voice got low and scary as he got closer. "Don't lie to me. I know your type. You people think you can get away with anything, don't you?" Sandy's eyes grew really big with shock. That kind of person. The words hurt her a lot. It wasn't just that she was stopped. It had to do with the color of her face. He didn't believe she was human, which made her sick. She said, "I'm not doing anything wrong," but it was so quiet that everyone could hear her. It was hard for her to get away from the man who made fun of her because she was different. She didn't move because she was scared and couldn't do anything. In one more step, Barry's face was now only a few inches away from hers. "You think being pregnant is going to get you out of this?" He told me. "You think I care about your little sob story?" Sandy was so short of breath. She had never heard his voice sound so cold and mean before. Though she had always known about racism, this was the first time she saw it in the open. It was really scary. As tears came to her eyes, she blinked them back. "Don't cry. Do not look scared. It will be used against you only," Sandra said again, in a voice that was almost a whisper. "I'm just trying to get home." She wasn't asking for forgiveness, but for kindness. So this man could think of her as someone who should be respected and honored. But Barry only laughed, and the sound of it made her feel cold. "You're not going anywhere," he told her, as he grabbed her stick tightly. "Get on the ground, now." Sandra's heart stopped beating. On the ground? She was shocked as she looked at her swollen stomach, and then back at him. "I can't," she said, in a weak voice. "I'm pregnant, please." It was clear that Barry was furious when he yelled, "I said get on the ground." His voice was tense, like it was about to explode. He was tired of playing games. It didn't matter to him what it took to hurt her. Sandra was trying to figure out what was going on while her legs were shaking. "It's not real. This can't happen." Still, it was, and she was by herself. She could see that there was nothing on the road behind them. No one was close to help or see what was going to happen. She knew she had to get away from this man who didn't seem to care about her safety. But she couldn't. Where would she go? Even though the first 10 seconds were scary, those 10 seconds felt like they were going by quickly now that Barry was standing over her and telling her to get on the ground. Something much worse was about to happen. Sandy did not move. She looked straight at Barry as he tightened his grip on the staff. She had no choice. She had to give up. She had to scrunch down to kneel, though, and a sharp, unbearable cramp made her gasp for air. She grabbed her stomach out of fear. As the pain got worse, the kid. Something went wrong. Barry gave her a cold look and didn't care that she looked like she was upset. He said over and over, "I told you to get on the ground." She couldn't, though. It was tough for her to breathe. It hurt too much. With shaky hands, she picked up the phone and called the only number she could think of. The phone rang, and she prayed. There was a problem. Sandy stood by the roadside with one hand over her big belly to cover it. Her heart was beating quickly. The bright red and blue lights of Officer Barry's squad car made scary shapes around them. But all she could think about was how scared she was. When the police officer walked up to her, her heart rate went up, and he looked mad. Why did he stop her? Things were getting out of hand, even though she hadn't done anything wrong. She didn't look like a threat to Officer Barry, who stood taller than her and put his hand on his gun. "Rest." He didn't pay attention to what she said and laughed at her answers. His voice was rude and full of insults when he told people what to do. "Get on the ground, now." Sandra had trouble taking deep breaths. Saying, "Officer, please, I'm pregnant," she tried to. Keep her cool, even though she knew things were getting worse. She made a mark, in an attempt to get him to understand that putting her on the ground was not only useless, but also dangerous. Surely he wouldn't do that. But Barry changed the color of his face and made his eyes narrow, as if what she said was a threat to his authority. He didn't care what she said or that she was pregnant. He was already sure she did something wrong, and her attempts to calm down made him even more angry. I told you to get on the ground, and tightly grabbed her arm. Sandy let out a gasp and stumbled as Barry pulled her down the path. She grabbed her stomach right away as pain shot through her middle. Her heart was beating fast with worry about her future child. Barry could see that she was scared, but she didn't seem to care or notice. It felt like everything was moving slowly, like a bad dream that never ended. A small crowd started to form after people walking by saw the loud noise and saw the bright lights. As their fears grew, some of them pulled out their phones to record what they saw. A pregnant black woman being SX'd by a white police cop. Even though it was wrong, no one has yet spoken out to stop it. The mood was tense, and people didn't want to get involved in anything that could go wrong. There was a crazy mix of fear and doubt in Sandra's mind as it raced. It's not likely that this will happen. She couldn't drive home from work because she was stressed about the last few weeks of her pregnancy. Suddenly, the man who was supposed to keep her safe threw her to the ground. Barry hurt her by pushing her down and pulling her arm behind her back. It hurt so much that her knees gave out and she screamed in pain. As she fought to stay upright and keep her baby safe from the fall, her voice cracked. "Please don't hurt me," she begged. But he didn't stop. His face became more serious as time went on, and his grip got tighter. He growled, "Stop resisting," as if he was sure she was a criminal who needed to be held down. Sandra didn't fight back, though. She was just trying to keep herself and her child safe. Barry seemed to get even more angry, but her words showed that she was scared. People in the crowd were shocked and confused, and some moved closer to see what was going on. Better. A few people told Barry, "She's pregnant," but he either didn't hear or didn't care. What he planned to do was clear to him. He was in charge, and Sandra was just another black person that he had to take care of. Barry pushed harder out of the blue, while Sandra was on her knees. As the shock went through her body, she gasped for air and held her stomach tight to protect herself. As she tried to catch her breath, the tears hurt her eyes. "Please," she begged, "please. Stop." Her screams were drowned out by Barry's. "Get down. Stop resisting." He tried to pull her down to the ground by putting his hand on her back, but Sandra's body fought back. It wasn't against him. It was against the strange situation and the pain and fear that were about to take over her. People who were there with them spoke up more as they saw the violence, and their worry turned to anger. Someone yelled as they held their phone high to film the whole horrifying scene. "She's not resisting. She's pregnant, man. What's wrong with you?" Barry didn't let the fact that there were more people stop him. He felt like he had to prove something to himself or to them, so he tried to do better. He was in charge of this. No one, not this black woman, not the people watching, could stand up to him. He turned around to look at Sandra again. She was shaking and trying to stay on her knees, even though her stomach and lower back hurt a lot. Sandra only had one thought on her mind, her child. Was everything all right? Could all of the stress and danger hurt her pregnant child? She had to stay safe and get through this. But how could she when the person who was supposed to protect her was fighting her? I can't breathe," she said under her breath. The worry made her voice rough. Barry's hand was tight on top of her, making it hard for her to breathe. Jones didn't give up, though. He seemed to press down even more, like he wasn't hearing her, or worse, didn't believe her. People became more willing to speak out as more saw how bad things were. Several people yelled to Barry's attention and help him understand what was going on. "Let her go. She didn't do anything," yelled one guy, his voice shaking with anger. But Barry didn't notice that the protests around him were getting worse. He was too far gone and caught up in his own power to see how bad he was being. It seemed like just another crime and another arrest to him. She was black and pregnant, but it didn't bother him. It didn't matter that she was a person. Everything was about him being in charge. The pain and fear were too much for Sandra's body to handle, and she could hardly see. She had no idea how bad things had become. What was she up to? She was good all the time. A man's blind anger was ruining everything she had worked for. She had worked hard and lived a quiet life. All of a sudden, one voice could be heard over the others. As soon as someone yelled, "Call for help," several people grabbed their phones and started recording. They also called 911 to report the police officer who was supposed to be guarding them. Barry stopped for the first time and looked at the people who had gathered around him. The air was less tense now. He felt heavy when they looked at him and rated him. When he let go of Sandra for a moment, she gasped for air and slumped, so happy. Still, it wasn't over. It was Barry's turn to glare at everyone. He still had a lot of power. He waved his free hand at them and yelled, "Back off. This is police business. She's under arrest." People in the crowd didn't believe it. The video on their phones was still recording, so they could remember every second of Barry's attack on the pregnant woman who couldn't fight back. There was no going back once the truth came out. It became clear over time that Barry's plan for how this would end would not work. Things were starting to go in a different direction, because the crowd didn't like what they were seeing and had strong evidence to back it up. He was no longer in charge. Sandra could still barely breathe. She knew she needed help right away because she wasn't sure how much longer her body could do this. Sandra was lying down on the cold, rough ground. She put her hand on her swollen stomach, even though her body was shaking. It wasn't just fear that made her feel like lightning was going through her. The little life inside her that had just kicked and squirmed was strangely still. Officer Barry stood above her and barked orders, which made her mind race with fear. When people didn't listen to him, his voice was full of anger. For the first 10 seconds of this moment, time seemed to stop. Each blow made it hard for her to breathe, and she knew how dangerous things were every time. She felt sharp, scary pain in her stomach after the fall. Barry was very angry. His eyes and face were both red with anger. The man didn't seem to understand how bad things were. The moment he saw her, he knew what kind of person she was. She was just another thief who didn't deserve to be helped or kept safe. Sandy's phone seemed to be buzzing even though it was only a few inches away. She had to get there. With one hand, she dragged herself across the curb while she reached for the phone. Her hands hit the ground and hurt. The people behind her were muttering more and more as they grew. She could feel how tense things were. Some people were protesting by recording and yelling, but no one was brave enough to jump in and help. They knew what could go wrong. Barry gripped the baton tighter, turning his fingers white, as he yelled again, "Stay down. I said stay down." His voice was clear because he was so mad at himself. Sandra had to get up. She finally got the phone, but it was hard for her to open because her hands were shaking. She was scared for her baby's safety and became more and more sure that things were going to go wrong, which made her heart race. This could not go on, not like this. She knew right away which number to press, because she had learned it as a child, and it was for her dad. He is aware of what to do. The first one hurt every second. She could hear it in her ears. Could he get it in time? Did he get how important what was going on? She gasped and tried to keep her mind on the task at hand, as another sharp pain shot through her stomach. She needed to pay attention. The crowd kept yelling, and some even told the police officer to stop, but Barry could only see what he was seeing. He thought he was in charge, at least. After the third ring, a deep voice that I knew came on. "Sandra, what's wrong?" She knew her dad could tell something wasn't right, even though his voice was calm. Since the baby is coming, he has always been aware of her and watched out for her. But this time, his voice had a little more edge to it. a quiet determination that made her think for a moment that she might be safe. She spoke in a broken voice, her throat getting tight with fear. "Dad." What could she say about what was going on? The words were stuck in her throat, but she took a few shaky breaths and pushed them out. "I'm on the ground. An officer. I need help. I'm scared." Sandy knew what her dad was thinking when the other end of the line went dead. Chief Wilson wasn't really a father. He was a strong man who had worked hard to become one of the best police chiefs in the state. No one else got how important what she said was. In a low voice, he asked Sandra, "Where are you? Tell me exactly where you are." She tried to talk, but her hands were shaking and she could only take short gasps of air. There was a steady hum of Barry's words in the background while he stood over her. She didn't really pay attention to what he said, though. At that moment, all she could think about was her dad's words, which held her close. "I'm by the road, near. Do not go through exit 22. He's not listening, Dad." This time, she lost her temper and her voice broke on the last word. She didn't need to say it. Her dad knew what she meant. Chief Wilson's jaw tightened. On the other end of the line, he knew exactly what was going on because he had seen or heard of similar situations. Happened too many times, including in cases he had personally handled. But this was different. His pregnant daughter was lying on the ground, under the boot of a man who didn't know what kind of storm he was letting into his life. "Listen to me, Sandra," Wilson said, in a sharp but cool tone. "Help is on the way. Try to stay cool, please. Take a deep breath. Take a deep breath and hold on. Do you hear me? I'm going to be there. I'm going to come." Sandra said yes, but he couldn't see her. She tried hard not to cry because she had to be strong for herself, her child, and the people she was trying to keep safe. His voice saved her, so she squeezed her phone even tighter. Barry, on the other hand, was still there. When he saw Sandra on the phone, he became even more angry. He walked up to her and growled, "Who are you calling?" When she asked for help, his face went crazy with doubt, as if that were another way for him to show that he didn't like it. "When I told Sandra to put down the phone, she didn't answer. She couldn't answer. Her dad was the only one who could save her. I told you I'd send backup right now, and I will be there too," the boss told the person on the phone. "Please stay on the line and talk to me some more." His eyes got narrow when he saw how determined Sandra looked, but he quickly brushed it off. This was his scene, or so he told himself. He was in charge, and he couldn't look bad in front of everyone right now. Sandra moved, but the pain in her stomach got worse. She tried to keep her breathing steady and listen to what her father was saying. When things were going badly, her dad always told her to stay calm and think straight, but this wasn't that. The tone was private. As she lay there, she began to have her first doubts. Would the fact that her dad was police chief be enough to change people's minds? Would she figure it out in time, before Barry made things even worse? She moved closer to Barry, who stood over her again and cast a long shadow over her. "Leave her alone," he yelled. "And she's excited." More people in the crowd yelled and screamed, and she could hear them. But no one did anything because they knew that going there would make things worse, so they didn't. A woman in the crowd spoke up and stopped the noise. "She didn't do anything," the woman yelled. "She's pregnant, for God's sake," she yelled with full-on anger. The crowd's mood was changing, even though Barry turned his head and glared at the voice. It was now his turn to be taped. Too many people were watching. He paused for the first time because he didn't know what to do next. The people he was trying to control were now testing his authority. The change in the crowd gave Sandra some hope that things might be going her way. Barry might finally give up. He might realize that he was going in the wrong direction and pay attention. The cop, on the other hand, clenched his teeth and gripped his stick even tighter. He didn't want to give up power. The voice of her dad on the phone came back. This time, it was steady and more important. "I'm almost there, Sandra. It will be 5 minutes. Come stay with me. Please do not hang up." Sandra nodded and swallowed hard as the minutes went by. She only had 5 minutes to hold on. We only have 5 minutes left. Could she make it? Her mind was racing, but she kept thinking about one thing. Her dad was coming, and things would be different when he got there. The officer stood tall and straightened his back as 2 more police cars arrived. He thought he was safe now that there was backup. Sandra was scared while lying on the ground with one hand over her stomach to protect herself. Would they make things worse? Being abused hurt her body, and she was scared for her baby. There were more people in the crowd, and more phones were recording the event. Barry took a quick look at them, but he didn't seem worried. He didn't care that people were taking pictures. He thought he was just doing his job. He saw Sandra as just another problem that needed to be solved. And he knew his coworkers would support him, as they always did. The other police officers slowly got out of their car and looked at what they saw. Sandra, a black woman who looked like she was pregnant, was on the ground, shaking and crying. Barry stood above her with his arms crossed and a strong air about him. People were whispering and gasping so loudly that it was hard to hear what they were saying. Barry gave the police officers a smug nod. He thought they would follow him because, as usual, he thought he had everything under control. But the way they looked told him this wasn't going to be like any other. Stop. The weight of the moment was thick and heavy in the air. First, the officer came up to Barry. He was a middle-aged man with gray hair. He looked quickly at Sandra and then back at Barry. "What's going on here?" he asked in a cool, level voice. "Resisting arrest," Barry said straight out. She was acting strangely and wouldn't cooperate. As usual, Sandra was having a hard time sitting up, and her breathing was getting worse. The officer looked back at her with a hint of suspicion. Something about this didn't feel right. He looked around at the people and the cameras that were filming everything. He felt sick to his stomach. He had been through this kind of thing too many times before. He could tell when another officer was using rules to hide something darker, but this time everyone could see. They had to be careful because everything they did was being recorded. The department couldn't afford another scandal right now, because relations between the community and the police were already very tense. The second officer, a younger man with a tense face, walked up to Barry and looked nervously back and forth between Barry and Sandra. He wasn't as good at his job as the others, but he could tell something wasn't right, because his hand was hovering near his belt, as if he wasn't sure whether to put it on his gun or keep it by his side. This showed that he was uncomfortable. Sandra, the younger officer, asked her directly for the first time, "Are you okay? Do you need to see a doctor?" Sandra looked up when she heard the question. This was the nicest thing anyone had done for her since Barry helped her get out of her car. She tried to answer, but her voice was shaky. It was hard for the woman to say, "I'm pregnant," with one hand still on her stomach. "Please, I just need help. I did not do anything wrong." People in the crowd were now talking louder, their voices rising with worry and anger. Many people agreed and yelled that they had seen everything, and Sandra hadn't done anything to deserve this. It looked like the older cop was a little more serious when he looked back at Barry. "You said you were trying to block an officer? But she's pregnant," he asked again, this time sounding less sure. What did the threat really mean? There was a question that made Barry tense up. He wasn't happy with how things were going. He was expecting his coworkers to help him right away, and, without any questions, not to be asked them. He shook his head and tightened his grip on his belt. He yelled, "Look, she was acting funny and wouldn't do what I asked. You already know how it is, so I won't say it again." The older officer didn't answer right away. He took a step back and looked at the scene again. This time, he saw the crowd, the cameras, Sandra on the ground, and Barry standing over her, angry. It didn't make sense. Moving closer to Sandra, the younger officer kept a close eye on her. He asked in a soft voice, "Mammy, could you tell us what happened? How did things get worse? Jenkins yelled at Sandra before she could answer. "Look at me, I've got this under control, don't put me down." There was a lot of stress in the air. People were looking at him. And the thought of Sandra lying on the ground made him feel bad. He had to deal with it. The crowd became more sure of itself when they saw the backup officers pause. They spoke louder and pointed their phones straight at Barry. "She didn't do anything," someone yelled in the crowd. Another person said, "You're beating her for no reason when she's pregnant." As one person in the crowd took a small step forward, his phone stayed on the scene. "This is all being recorded," he said. "Definitely. We saw what happened. We have proof." Barry clenched his fists and his face turned snarl-like as he stared at the crowd, getting more and more angry. Things weren't supposed to be going this way. He was supposed to be in Shar-Gethbos. But as the backup cops hesitated and the crowd turned against him, things were changing in terms of power. It was clear that the older officer didn't like how things were going, so he turned back to Barry. "You need to calm down," he told her in a firm but quiet voice. "We're not looking for a fight here." Barry clenched his teeth, and his pride hurt. Before he could answer, though, the noise of tires screeching cut through. When a stylish black SUV pulled up, everyone turned to see who was inside, but the tinted windows made it hard to see. The crowd was quiet because they knew something big was about to happen. The car made Barry frown and squint. He didn't think anyone else would show up. Who the hell was this? When the SUV door opened, a big, tall black man in a nice suit walked out. He caught everyone's eye right away. People in the crowd were quiet even though he was talking a lot. There was an air of power around him. She could hardly breathe when she saw him. She felt better even though tears were still running down her face. Her dad had shown up. That's when Barry's face fell. It was Chief Wilson, who was in charge of the city's police force, and Sandra's dad. He felt less sure of himself when he realized what was going on. He had no idea he had just hit someone. Chief Wilson was clearly mad, but he moved slowly toward the crime scene. He didn't look at the people around him or the cops. He only looked at his daughter, who was still on the ground, and the person who was standing over her. The backup cops left right away because they knew the power had changed hands. Barry, on the other hand, stood still, trying to figure out how bad things were. He had just hit the police chief's daughter, and there were cameras everywhere. Chief Wilson got on his knees next to Sandra and helped her slowly stand up. His voice was soft and sweet as he checked on her to make sure she was okay. "Are you hurt?" was a quiet question. "Is the child okay?" Sandy nodded through her tears. She felt so much better having her dad here. "I'm okay, Dad," she whispered. "But he attacked me." These words made Chief Wilson's eyes darken and his jaw tighten. He slowly stood up and turned to face Barry. His face was as steely as his words. The crowd held their breath. The stress was almost too much to handle. They knew Barry would have to deal with the consequences of what he did. Barry tried to talk, but he couldn't get the words out. He stuttered and tried to think of a reason, but what he said now wouldn't matter. Chief Wilson moved closer and screamed in a low, angry voice that was hard to hold back. A black SUV pulled up, its engine low and threatening against the growing crowd's tense silence. "Explain yourself, Officer Barry." Sandra tried to calm her breathing while lying on the ground, in pain, with her hands on her swollen stomach. The door to the sleek car opened, and the late afternoon sun glinted off the shiny metal and made her heart race. As soon as a big, tall black man walked out, everyone turned their attention to him. He was wearing a dark suit and had a hard-to-read expression. His eyes were as cold as ice and seemed to stop time for a moment. Sandra's neck tightened when she realized her father had arrived. Officer Barry, the white police officer who had been roughing up Sandra moments before, was still nearby. He stood straight, as if he was sure of his authority. His hand was on his holster, and the threat of his strength was still there. He didn't think anyone important would show up, especially not someone so powerful that they would rock his world. As the man walked up, the slowly growing crowd whispered. Some knew him from the local news, while others remembered him from when he spoke at press conferences about the safety of the city. It wasn't just anyone. It was Sandra's dad, Chief Wilson, who is the city's police chief. The mood changed right away, in the first 10 seconds. But Barry still didn't fully understand who he was dealing with. He continued to walk slowly toward Sandra, looking around at the new police officers whose cars were parked on either side of the scene as if they were watching. Barry believed that having more backup gave him more power and made his story more likely to be true. It was odd, though, that when he looked at his co-workers, they weren't looking at him. The air around him seemed to get tighter because his co-workers, who had been quick to pay attention to him when they first arrived, didn't seem to know what to do. Barry had no idea what it meant. Wasn't this just a normal stop that went wrong? A simple check that got worse when the black woman wouldn't cooperate. A black woman in a car? Their sudden reluctance made his eyes narrow as he tried to figure out what was going on. Chief Wilson walked toward the scene and didn't change his face. He was looking straight at his daughter. He took his time and walked slowly. He felt strong, so he didn't have to yell or move faster. He got closer to Sandra, who was still on the ground and shaking from fear and pain. The truth was slowly but surely coming out, even though it hadn't been said out loud yet. Sandra's father was more than just another worried citizen. He was the boss and had taught all of the police officers here. Even Barry, who had no idea who he was beating up on the side of the road. Chief Wilson knelt down and carefully checked on Sandra, while moving slowly and carefully. He lightly touched her shoulder with his big hand, and his voice was both worried and angry. "Sandra," he asked in a soft voice, "are you okay?" Sandra gave him a weak nod, her eyes showing a mix of fear and relief. "Dad," she said in a shaking whisper, "he hurt me. I swear I didn't do anything." Wilson's jaw tightened. He could tell his daughter was scared when they talked on the phone. But seeing her in real life, weak and scared, made him very angry. He had heard so many stories like this from victims. They were taught to be better than Thisto, protect, not hurt. Now, he saw his daughter, the person he loved most in the world, lying on the ground like she was a criminal. He slowly stood up and turned to face Barry. When they looked at each other, the air seemed to stop moving. Barry's face was smug because he still didn't know how bad his mistake was. Wilson spoke with a cold voice and told the officer, "Step away from her now." Barry blinked and raised his lips in a rude way. He bragged, "Sir, I've got this under control." There was a brief pause. Wilson's eyes got darker, and the other police officers looked at each other with worry. "She's been resisting arrest and making a disturbance." Some of them were getting ready for what was going to happen because they knew who their boss was. It was clear to everyone but Barry what was true. "Resisting arrest?" Chief Wilson asked in a calm voice. "Is that what you think happened here, Officer Barry?" Barry firmly nodded, but he still didn't know what was going on. "That's right," he said. Chief Wilson kept his cool and didn't look away as he spoke. "She wasn't compliant. I gave her several warnings, but she refused to follow my instructions. I had to use force to maintain control. But his calmness wasn't one that made me feel better. People knew they were in over their heads because of the man's dominant calm. Barry didn't see the warning signs, even though they were there. He had too much faith in his own ideas about how the world worked. Sandra was just another black woman who needed help. He was the police officer in charge. As Wilson took a quiet step forward, he asked, "Do you know who I am, Officer Barry?" Barry raised an eyebrow as if the question didn't matter. He said, "No, sir. I don't see why that's important here." One more beat of silence. As they looked at Wilson and Barry, their faces were tense. It was clear that Barry was making things worse, and he had no way out. There was nothing funny about Wilson's smile. "I'm Chief Wilson," he said, and the words shook the air like thunder. "The chief of this department. And that woman you just assaulted? She's my daughter." He thought the news had hit him right in the gut. Right away, he lost his cocky look and was filled with confusion and then fear. He spoke, but nothing came out. It was too late for him to change his mind about what he had done. Everything about the balance of power had changed. While they were still recording, people around them began to talk. Sandra was lying on the ground and saw her dad stand in front of her to protect her from the man who had just hit her. The last thing Barry did was find out who he was working with. He felt it like a hammer. He stuttered as he tried to take charge again, but it was too late. "I didn't know," he said, in a weak voice. His words were cut off by Wilson's cold look. "I didn't know she was your daughter," he stated. "It doesn't matter who she is. What matters is how you treated her. You used unnecessary force on a pregnant woman. You didn't care about her safety or her humanity. That's the issue, Officer Barry." The crowd was now quiet. The moment was heavy on everyone. The color of Barry's face had changed, and he didn't seem as cocky as he did when he first approached Sandra. The other police officers didn't stand up for him because they knew they couldn't. Wilson took a deep breath to calm down. He knew he was mad at more than just Barry, even though he was mad at Barry. Not only his daughter, but also other black people who were meant to protect them had been rude to them. There were only black people there. There had been too many examples of this kind of crime for him to count. Now, it was happening to him. He used a firm voice to talk to one of the close police officers. Wilson told the police, "Get paramedics over here right now to check on my daughter and make sure she's safe." As they rushed to do what he said, Wilson looked back at Barry, who looked like he knew his job was in danger. There was no going back once the truth came out. Wilson said in a low voice, "You'll answer for this." Barry stood still as the truth of what he had done hit him. People in the crowd moved around and used their phones to take shots of everything. The effects were just beginning, even though the truth had been told. Sandy wasn't trying to get away, but the cop stood still and kept his tight grip on her arm. Little bursts of air came out of his mouth. It was getting old to be excited about being arrested too fast. Something had changed in the air around him very quickly, but he still didn't fully understand what was going on. The black SUV that had just pulled up caught his eye. Everyone looked like they were paying attention. Barry felt something strange in his stomach when the tall, scary figure walked out of the back door. Head Wilson, Sandra's dad, and the police head got out of the car with N. He seemed to be very powerful in a quiet way. His face was hidden, but you could tell he was moving slowly and carefully. Big Barry blinked. It was hard for him to put the pieces together. Her dad was the police chief. He kept his eyes on his daughter Sandra the whole time Chief Wilson walked toward her. It looked like time was moving more slowly. He didn't look at the crowd, the other police officers, or even Barry at first. Things that were important to him at that time were Sandra and nothing else. The air felt tense, like before a storm. Sandy held her swollen stomach and twisted her face in pain and fear while she stayed on the ground. Even though seeing her dad made her feel better, what had happened in her mind kept her there. She was crying because it was so hard for her to breathe. Chief Wilson knelt down next to her and put his big hand on her shoulder. "Sandra," he spoke in a soft, worried voice. "Are you okay? Did he hurt you or the child?" Sandy was crying so hard she could hardly talk. She said in a shaking voice, "Dad, he grabbed me. He wouldn't pay attention. He said I was going to fight back, but I wasn't." Wilson tensed his eyes as he heard his daughter's words. He had been a police officer for a long time and knew the kind of person Officer Barry was. Someone who let their prejudices get the best of them and saw a black person as a threat, especially one who was standing up for themselves. Sandra was in Chief Wilson's mind the whole time. He told the doctors to come over. "Check her out. Make sure she and the child are safe," he said in a calm voice. The paramedics carefully ran over to help. Barry was only a few feet away, and his heart was racing. He was starting to understand how serious things were. But not quite yet. The police chief's daughter was pregnant. He remembered the first time he heard Sandra's angry voice and thought she was telling him a story. Now, he knew he had been wrong. Barry's hand was still on his gun holster. He hadn't let go of the response yet, even though things were less dangerous. He took a deep breath and began to sweat. He felt tense as he looked at the other police officers who had come. They knew they were being watched. First, Chief Wilson got up from kneeling next to Sandra and looked at Barry for the first time. The chief's eyes were so heavy that Barry thought the ground might give way. Wilson walked slowly and carefully toward him, his face still hidden and his stance stiff. Barry could tell that a storm was coming from below. The other cops, who had come because they thought it was just a normal backup call, stood off to the side, not sure what to do. They knew this wasn't going to happen again. He opened his mouth to talk, to try to defend what had happened, but nothing came out. His mind was racing, but he just couldn't come up with a way to spin this now. Not with the police chief standing in front of him, the cameras, the phones held up by the crowd, and the whispers of the people watching him, closing in on him like a trap. Officer Barry was told by Chief Wilson, in a low, angry voice, "Get away from my daughter." Wilson could see that Barry's hand was still moving around near his gun because he stopped a little too long. The chief looked down at Barry's hand and said, "Get out of the way." Wilson said it again, and this time, his voice cut through the tension like a knife. Barry finally took a step back and put his hands up to show he wasn't going to hurt him. His heart was beating fast, and for the first time, he felt a little scared. He hadn't planned for things to go this way. Barry stuttered. "I didn't know." The words came out badly. "I had no idea who she was. I believed she was." "What did you think she was?" "Barry," he spoke up, and Chief Wilson's voice was cold and strong. "You thought she was just another black woman you could control? You thought she wouldn't fight back and would be easy to scare?" Barry blinked quickly, and each word broke the truth of his mistake even more. He believed his badge gave him authority over everyone there, so he believed he was in charge. He didn't think about the fact that he wasn't the strong one this time, though. Barry began to say, "I didn't mean," but was stopped by the chief. "What's wrong is, no, Barry, you didn't think. You didn't think at all. When you saw my daughter, you thought the worst. Because she was black, you thought she was scary. You thought you could treat her however you wanted." The other police officers were afraid to speak up, so they didn't. They all didn't want to be Barry right now, because they knew where this was going. Another step forward was made by Chief Wilson. It might be unsafe for him now that his voice was low and quiet. "Think about what could have happened today." He asked Barry, "Do you know how close you were to hurting my daughter and my grandchild?" Barry stopped wanting to eat because what he had done was so heavy that it was making it hard for him to breathe. It didn't matter how much training, power, or badge he had. When he faced the man who was much stronger than he thought possible, Barry whispered, "I'm sorry, Chief. I didn't mean for things to get out of hand. I had no idea she was." He finally lost it when he said, "You didn't need to know who she was. You didn't need to know she was my daughter for you to be nice to her. You did not do your job as an officer or as a person," Chief Wilson told him. It was like the chief's words were a blank on Barry's mind. He couldn't defend himself or explain what he had done. In an instant, the chief had taken away his power, and he was now standing in the mess of what he had done. Chief Wilson's anger was back in check, after taking a step back. The other officers were now looking at what was going on. In a quiet voice, the chief said, "Arrest him." There was no way to fight with that. The police thought about it for a second before going ahead with their plan. He was shocked when the cold metal of the handcuffs snapped around his wrists. It was time for Barry to leave, and Chief Wilson turned back to Sandra, who was now being checked out by paramedics. He was relieved to see that she and the baby were okay, but he was still hurt, angry, and frustrated. Sandra was sad and thankful at the same time when she looked at her dad. She knew that not having him there on time could have turned out badly, and that the story's ending could have been very different. As she watched Barry being led away, she knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over yet. Officer Barry had been in charge just a few minutes before, barking orders and hitting Sandra without thinking twice. Now, there was a lot of stress in the air, and everyone was looking at the two men, the attacker and the victim's father. Chief Wilson stood tall, and his face showed that he was angry, but not outburst angry. The first few seconds were very quiet between them. Barry had moved back a little to keep his strength, but it was quickly fading. His clothes used to show how strong he was, but now that he knew what was going on, they felt like heavy weights. This wasn't a normal meeting. Every police officer there knew that the man in front of them wasn't just a worried dad, but the chief of police. Chief Wilson looked angry, but he held it in. His jaw was tight, and even though he hadn't said anything yet, it was clear that Barry was in big trouble. Sandra, who was still sitting on the ground, watched the scene through tears. The number of people watching had grown, and their phones were raised to record every moment. While they waited for the storm to end, there was complete silence. "What did Officer Barry do here?" asked the chief in a cool but authoritative voice that made no one argue. Even though he spoke in a quiet voice, it was clear that he was scared. Barry failed the first time. He reached right for his belt, as if he was hoping that his badge, gun, or something else that would remind him of his place would make him feel better. But at this point, the badge's weight didn't seem important because of what was going on. This is not how things were supposed to go. He had hoped that his fellow soldiers would help him and stick together. They didn't want to look at Chief Wilson, so they kept quiet and stood behind him. He took a deep breath and tried not to make a noise. "Sir, she was refusing to be arrested. I was following the rules." Even he thought what he said was weak. There were a lot of holes in his case. When someone who knew the plan better than anyone else saw it. The boss, Wilson, stepped closer, and his eyes got narrow. "How do you do it?" His voice was low, but it had a clear edge to it. "So you thought it was okay to drag a pregnant woman to the ground?" There was a cold sweat on the back of Barry's neck. He opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. What could he say to explain this? He did what he did because it was what he always did, and because of a tendency he had never thought about. She was just another black suspect in his eyes. She wasn't her own person. She was someone to rule over. "I asked you a question," Chief Wilson said, more loudly. "Why did you make things worse? Why did you hit a pregnant woman with force?" Barry got lost and asked his fellow police officers for help, but no one came to his aid. They stood there like statues and didn't move because they knew it would hurt their jobs to back Barry at this point. The event wasn't like any other. It was important and happened during the day in front of a growing crowd. Cell phones caught every second of it. Words came out badly when Barry said, I didn't know she was pregnant. She wasn't following through. And I wasn't following through." Chief Wilson spoke up and ended the talk. The cold look in his eyes showed that he was very mad. "Officer Barry, what about her actions made you think she was dangerous? Did the fact that she had her hands up make you think she was even more dangerous? Did the fact that she kept telling you she was pregnant make you think she was even more dangerous?" He opened his mouth and then shut it again. When he tried to give reasons, he knew they weren't strong enough to stand up to Chief Wilson's questions. The police officer's mind was racing as he desperately tried to think of something, anything, that would make what he did okay. But there was nothing. Chief Wilson walked up to Barry, and his big body cast a long shadow over him. "Let me be clear about something," Wilson said, in a low voice that sounded almost angry. "It doesn't matter who you are, what you think you saw, or what your biases tell you. Because my daughter is black, you thought you could get away with hurting her." Barry jerked when he heard the sharp words. It was clear what was going on, and there was no way out. By saying that someone felt struck or thought they were in danger, He did what he did because he was biased, and now it was hurting him in the worst way possible. When Barry tried again, Williams cut him off with an angry voice. "I swear, Chief. I didn't know." He moved closer and asked, "Didn't know what, Officer Barry? That she was my daughter? Or that your race or bias was clear?" The crowd's words made the worry level rise. The strong man in front of them would expect accountability. As a father and as the head of the police force, this was the moment they had all been waiting for. Because of what one cop did, the police force was about to fall apart. With a lot of thoughts going through his mind, Barry's mouth was dry. He no longer felt confident and powerful in his uniform because of Chief Wilson's harsh look. She was stopped on the side of the road, and he had no idea what would happen. He had seen her as just another person to hurt and abuse. It was even worse that he didn't like her or her dad. The chief stood up straight, and his voice became calm again. This time, though, it had the weight of confidence to it. "Barry, you didn't need to make things worse by touching my daughter, or being mean to her the way you did. You just saw the color of her skin and thought you could do whatever you wanted." There was pain in Barry's chest from hearing those words. The quiet between them had been getting worse for what seemed like hours. Every second felt like it was busier than the last. "I didn't mean for this to happen, sir," Barry told the man, but the man didn't believe him. Claims like, "I felt threatened," or "she wasn't complying," have worked so many times in the past. Now, though, they didn't. He wasn't ready for how fast things were changing. Chief Wilson's eyes got very narrow. "You didn't mean for this to happen?" he asked over and over, with a mean tone in his voice. "Officer, what did you really mean to happen? Did you think my daughter would give in because you told her to? Because she was scared?" "They didn't look." "Were you sure? No cameras? Not many people? Like always. Did you think the system would keep you safe?" Barry had a fast heartbeat. Every word felt like a punch in the gut. He always believed that the system would keep him safe, and that what he did was okay, as long as he could explain it. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't dealing with just anyone. It was the police chief's daughter. Chief Wilson's face was hard to read, but his eyes were cold and determined. "This is what's going to happen, Barry," he said, in a steady, quiet voice. "You'll have to deal with the results of what you did, just like everyone else. I will make sure that all of the people you've hurt get what's coming to them. Not just my daughter." Barry got really sick all at once. The line was now over. There was no way to go back to the right path. When Chief Wilson took a step back, he looked at the close police officer. The crowd was shocked and quiet. They heard Wilson say, "Arrest Officer Barry." He had a loud voice. "For assault." The shocked police officers moved quickly to help. They quickly put Barry in handcuffs as the crowd began to move. Barry knew that there was a lot less power than before. He was no longer in charge. He was being taken away and had to deal with what he put in place. The crowd began to cheer for the first time in Barry's career as he was taken away. Together, they made a wave of winning sounds. All the time, phone records were kept, so everyone could see what was going on. At least for now, everything was fair. They would both be hurt by what happened, though. And those wounds would last long after the cameras stopped rolling. She was still scared as she watched her dad stand tall, his face tough but determined. Rescuers were now all around her. She was sure the fight would go on for a long time. But she did have a little hope, right now. Many people hadn't stood up for her, but he did. The medics slowly took Sandra's pulse while she leaned against the side of the van. The air was tense. She was scared, shocked, and excited about what had just happened, even though it was cool outside. Her heart was beating fast. Not to her, not to Chief Wilson's daughter, the man the whole city admired and trusted. When Officer Barry saw her from across the scene, he didn't care about any of that. She knew that as she sat there. A lot of people were there, and most of them had their phones. up to record the drama that turned a normal traffic stop into an event seen all over the world. Everyone was looking at them. When the crowd learned who her father was and how Barry's job wasn't enough to stop him from making racist assumptions about him, they became even more shocked and angry. It was now clear that Barry had been racist, and there was no turning back. Officer Barry kept looking back and forth between Chief Wilson and the other police officers who were waiting for orders. Barry's face went pale as he realized how bad what he had done was. He wasn't as sure of himself as he had been before. He had to deal with both a report and his boss's anger. There was only a few feet between Barry and Chief Wilson. His face was hard to read, but he was strong. His steps toward Barry were slow and careful, like a stalker getting a feel for his prey. When Sandra's dad yelled, which wasn't often, people paid attention. Today, he didn't even need to yell. His calm, cold look said it all. When Chief Wilson stopped in front of Barry and stood tall, everyone stopped talking. There was a long, tense pause before the chief spoke. He did nothing but stare at the man who touched his daughter. It was the chief's turn to talk, but no one knew what he would say next. It was too quiet to stand. The chief spoke in a low but firm tone. "You're going to tell me why you thought it was okay to touch a pregnant woman? The most important thing I want to know is why you touched my daughter." Barry thought the words hit him hard. He opened and closed his mouth a lot, but he couldn't say anything straight. His mind was very active. He did something wrong and couldn't get away with it. For no reason, and since everyone in the city saw, there was no way out. It was hard for Barry to speak again. "Sir, Tu didn't know who she was," he said. He raised his hands to protect himself, and fear filled his eyes. "I didn't know she was your daughter." He was cut off by a sharp look from the boss. "She shouldn't matter," he said, in a harsh tone. "What matters is that she's a human being, a woman, and you treated her like she was a criminal simply because of the color of her skin." He tried to speak again, but nothing came out. What was going on was becoming clear. There was no reason to save him because of what he did. He did racist things, and now he had to deal with the effects, which were much worse than he thought they would be. "I've known about you, Barry," Chief Wilson said in a calm voice. "I've heard the complaints and stories about how you act. But I didn't care. I thought it could be fixed if they were taught and watched. I was wrong, though." He took a deep breath in, but his heart was racing too fast. He thought that everyone was judging him. He was no longer in charge. His first thought was how badly he had been wrong about everything. The chief waved his hand at the other police officers, and his face turned serious. "Cuff him," he told them. The cops thought about it for a moment and then decided not to do it. Their power had changed, and they knew they couldn't stop what had to happen. Barry used to be one of them. Barry's bonds were taken off as the cops moved slowly toward him. Because Barry jerked, he took a step back. "Wait!" As his voice got worse, he yelled, "You can't do this. I was doing my job." "Your job?" Chief Wilson's voice was cold. "Your job was to protect and serve, not to attack innocent people, not to harass women, not to act on the worst kind of hate." The crowd agreed, and their anger was clear. Barry could feel the walls closing in on him as things got tighter. He made himself look bad because he couldn't get past his own prejudices. As the cops got closer, Barry made one last desperate plea. "I didn't mean that. I thought she was trying to get away from the police." The chief looked at her and shook his head. The tone of his voice, "Stop talking," was like a judge giving a punishment. "Anything you say from here on out will only make things worse for you." Chains that clicked into place were round Barry's hands. The police officer, who used to be sure of himself and easily used his power against other people, could no longer do anything. The crowd cheered, and the noise they made was a mix of happiness and anger. They saw too many times like this where powerful people picked on and hurt black people. This time, though, it was fair. Things were different this time. Sandra was safe in the back of the ambulance. She put her hands on her belly and watched what was going on. She was happy, scared, and angry, among other strange emotions. Because her father was powerful, she always thought she was mostly safe. But Barry still struck her. Some people, like Barry, thought she wasn't human because she was black. Barry was taken to a waiting police car while his face was sad. It was then Chief Wilson who turned around and walked back toward Sandra. He became calmer as he approached her, got down on his knees, and grabbed her hand. He used to have a cold, authoritative voice, but now it was filled with the fear of a father. His soft question, "Are you okay, sweetheart?" made her look at him to see if she looked upset. Sandra said yes, but her voice was a little rough. Her words were barely audible. "I'm okay now. I just couldn't believe it was happening." She thought she broke up with him because she was so mad. "I thought he was going to hurt my dad, really hurt me." Even though Chief Wilson's face went red again, this time, he did it with the care of a parent. He told her, "No one will hurt you." "No, again. Not while I'm here." Sandy thanked him for being strong and squeezed his hand, but she still felt scared. Barry wasn't normal. He was part of a system that had been after people like her for a very long time. Even though her father was strong, she knew this wasn't the first time she'd been hated in this way. The crowd began to break up as the police car drove away with Barry in the back seat. A lot of people got the event on camera, and it was ready to be shared with the whole world. It wasn't just an event, it pointed to something bigger. Sandra put her hands on her stomach and watched the car drive off. She knew she would be okay, but this day would scar her for a long time. When she looked at her dad, who was still watching over her, she felt a wave of gratitude. Deep down, though, she had a strong desire to fight back against the system that let guys like Barry live. As the sun went down over the city, long shadows moved across the street. Sandra knew that this event, which would be recorded on camera and seen by everyone, would cause people to protest, talk, and maybe even make a difference. But she knew the fight wasn't over. Right now, there was justice, but tomorrow, the fight for equality would continue. Let me know in the comments section what interests you the most in this story. It takes me lots of time to put this story together for you. Kindly leave a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel and share this video. Also, check out our channel for more stories like this. Let's meet over there.